All right, let's dive into one of the most critical jobs in any clinical microlab, figuring out which antibiotics will work against Staphylococcus. Getting this right is a huge deal. It directly impacts patients. So today, we're going to break down the essential CLSI standards that guide every single move we make.
And in this quote right here, it gets straight to the point. This isn't just a lab exercise. An accurate result can be the difference between a patient getting better fast or battling a really serious, even life-threatening infection. In our world, precision is everything.
Okay, so let's set the stage. We're not just talking about a single type of bacteria here. The Staphylococci are this huge, clinically important family of bugs, and they can cause everything from a simple skin infection to deadly sepsis.
And these guidelines we're talking about, they apply to a whole lineup of them. You've got the big one, Staphylococcus aureus, and its notorious cousin, MRSA. But we're also talking about the S. aureus complex and a whole bunch of what we call coagulates negative staph, or CONS. And these are a bigger and bigger deal, especially in hospitals.
Now, if you want results you can trust, you need a method you can trust. You can't just wing it. The Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute, CLSI, lays out some very specific, non-negotiable rules for testing. Let's take a look at what they are.
Just look at how precise this has to be. It doesn't matter if you're doing disc diffusion on a plate or a broth dilution to get an MIC, the rules are ironclad. You've got to use a specific Mueller-Hinton media, get your inoculum just right at 0.5 McFarlane, and incubate exactly 35 degrees Celsius. There's just no wiggle room, because consistency is what gives us accuracy. And that temperature rule, I can't stress this enough, it is absolutely critical. If your incubator is running just a little hot, say 37 degrees instead of 35, the gene that causes resistance might not turn on. That means you could have an MRSA on your plate, but you'd miss it, report it as susceptible, and that could lead directly to treatment failure. So remember, 35 degrees. It's not a suggestion, it's a rule.
For disc diffusion, reading the plate the right way is just as important as setting it up. You have to give the discs enough space so the zones are clear. Then you measure the area where growth is completely stopped. And you do it with your own eyes. This part's key. You have to ignore any faint, hazy growth or tiny little colonies you might see if you squint or use a magnifier. They don't count.
Okay, let's jump right into detecting methicillin resistance. And I really can't stress this enough. Every single decision you make from here on out completely depends on getting this first step right. Think of it as the ultimate fork in the road for treating any staph infection. So what's the actual culprit we're hunting for? Well, it all comes down to this one little protein, PBP2A. The best way to think about it is like a modified lock on the bacteria. The antibiotic, your key, in this case methicillin, just doesn't fit anymore. And where does this funky protein come from? It's coded by a gene, either MEC-A or MEC-C. So if you can find that gene, or the PBP2A protein itself, well, that's your smoking gun. It's definitive proof of resistance. Now, here's where things get kinda tricky. The best tool for the job actually depends on which exact species of staph you're dealing with. So for the one we see all the time, S. aureus, you'll see that cefotaxetin is the way to go. It's the preferred marker, not oxacillin. But then you look at something like S. pseudointermedius, and it's the total opposite. Getting that little detail right is absolutely critical if you want an accurate result. And this leads us to what is the hard and fast, non-negotiable rule. Listen to this. If you find the gene, or you find the PBP2A protein, or a recommended test like the cefotin disc comes back resistant, it doesn't matter what anything else says. You stop right there. You have to report that bug as methicillin resistant. It's basically an any of the above wins kind of deal. No ifs, ands, or buts. Okay, so you found a methicillin-resistant staph. Awesome. Now what? That brings us to section 2, where we see how that one finding triggers the single most important rule in the entire playbook. We're talking about the universal beta-lactam rule. Okay, this right here is huge. You need to burn this into your brain. This comes straight from the CLSI guidelines, and it's ironclad. What it's saying is this. Your lab tests might show that the bug is susceptible to some other beta-lactam antibiotic, but don't fall for it. In a real patient, those drugs are going to fail. You have to ignore those misleading lab results and just call everything resistant. The only, and I mean only, exception to this rule is a newer drug called ceftaroline. And believe me, this rule casts a really wide net. We're not just talking about basic penicillins here. Nope. This covers the combination drugs, like amoxicillin clavulanate. It covers pretty much all the cephalosporins, and yeah, even the big guns, the carbapenems. The second that isolate gets flagged as methicillin resistant, this whole arsenal of drugs is just gone. It's completely off the table. All right, but what about the flip side? What if your isolate is actually methicillin susceptible? Well, that opens up a whole different can of worms with its own set of rules. So let's jump into Section 3 and talk about the specifics for testing other penicillins. You can really see the two different pathways you have to take here. On one side, let's say you're testing regular old penicillin, and it looks like it's susceptible. Great, but you're not done yet. There's a mandatory second step. You absolutely have to check if the bug is making beta-lactamase. Now, on the other side, if you're looking at those penicillinase stable drugs like nafcillin, things are simpler. That first result you got with oxacillin or cefoxitin, that's all you need. It tells you the whole story. So as soon as you say MRSA, what's the first drug everyone thinks of? Vancomycin, right? It's the go-to workhorse. But, and this is the big but, using this drug comes with its own very strict set of rules, and that's what we're covering in Section 4. Okay, rule number 1 for vancomycin, and this is a biggie. You must do an MIC test. A simple disc diffusion test? Just throw that idea out. It's not reliable enough to catch the kind of subtle resistance that can really matter for a patient. And you need to pay super close attention to these numbers. For S. aureus, if you see an MIC of 8 or higher, that's an immediate red flag. You've got to send that isolate to a reference lab. For all the other staph species, that trigger point is an MIC of 32. All right, we're in the home stretch now. For our last section, we're going to do a kind of rapid-fire review of some super important reporting rules for a few other key antibiotics you'll definitely come across. First on our list is clindamycin. Now, this is a classic trap. If you see that your bug is resistant to erythromycin, it could be playing possum. It might be hiding a resistance to clindamycin that you won't see with a normal test. And that's exactly why the D-zone test becomes mandatory. It's designed to uncover that hidden resistance so you don't end up giving a patient a drug that's doomed to fail. Next up, daptomycin. This one's about as simple and direct as it gets. You report the MIC, sure, but you never use it or report it for lung infections like pneumonia. Why not? Well, there's this stuff in your lungs called surfactant, and it literally just shuts the drug down, making it completely useless there. Okay, let's talk about these two together, rifampin and gentamicin. Think of them as a team because they share one critical rule. The problem is, staph can learn to resist these drugs incredibly fast, like shockingly fast. And because of that, you can never use them by themselves. They must always be part of a combination therapy. And now for nitrofurantoin. This drug is a true specialist. It does one job and it does it really well. See, it gets super concentrated in urine, which makes it fantastic for UTIs. But it doesn't really get to high enough levels anywhere else in the body. So the rule couldn't be simpler. You only report its susceptibility for isolates that come from the urine. That's it. Here's a neat little efficiency trick. When you're dealing with the tetracycline family of drugs, you don't actually have to test every single one. If the bug is susceptible to the main drug, tetracycline, you can pretty much guarantee it's also going to be susceptible to doxycycline and minocycline. So you get 3 answers for the price of 1 test. It's a great shortcut.
You know, to help us be smarter about using antibiotics, CLSI suggests something called a tiered or cascade reporting system. And the whole idea is pretty simple. Report the most basic, narrow-spectrum drugs first. That's your Tier 1. You only start reporting the bigger guns from the higher tiers if the bug is resistant to the first-line options or if it's a really high-risk situation.
Wow, we've covered a ton of information. So let's bring it all home and focus on the biggest takeaways, starting with something called intrinsic resistance.
Some types of staph are just born resistant to certain drugs. It's built into their DNA. Take Staphylococcus saprophyticus. It's a common cause of urinary tract infections, and it is naturally intrinsically resistant to novobiocin. This means it doesn't matter what your lab test says. We know from its basic biology that the drug won't work. It's a fundamental rule that always trumps the lab result.
And this idea gets even bigger. All staphylococci, every single species, are intrinsically resistant to drugs like aztreonam and polymyxin B. Their cell wall is just built in a way that these drugs can't touch them. So you should never even test these drugs against a staph isolate. It's a waste of resources and could create a really dangerous, misleading report.
Okay, so let's boil it all down.
If you remember nothing else, remember these key pearls. Intrinsic resistance is king. It always wins. Cephaloxactin is your best friend for finding MRSA. If you find MRSA, all the beta-lactams are off the table except for ceftaroline. Vancomycin absolutely needs an MIC test. Rifampin and gentamicin always need a partner. And if you see that D shape, clindamycin is a no-go.
And that brings us to one last thought. All these rules we've gone over, they're based on the best science we have right now. But bacteria are always changing, always evolving. New resistance mechanisms are popping up all the time, reminding us that we can never get complacent. So the real question we always have to be asking ourselves is this: how are we going to adapt to stay one step ahead and keep our patients safe tomorrow? Thanks for tuning in.